The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting gentle shadows across the breakfast table where the Wales family had gathered for what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. Catherine sat quietly, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold, while William absently buttered toast that he had no intention of eating. Their 3 children chattered amongst themselves, blissfully unaware of the weight that had settled over their parents like a heavy blanket. Prince George, now 11 and, growing more perceptive by the day, noticed the unusual silence first. His parents, normally engaged and talkative during family meals, seemed lost in their own thoughts. Princess Charlotte, ever the observant middle child, had been stealing glances at her mother throughout breakfast, sensing something amiss in the way Catherine's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. But it was Prince Louis, their youngest at just 6 years old, who remained completely absorbed in arranging his cereal into perfect rows, humming softly to himself as he often did when concentrating. The previous evening had been different. William and Catherine had spent hours in William's study after putting the children to bed, their voices hushed but tense as they discussed the conversation they'd had with Dr. Matthews, Louis's developmental pediatrician. The appointment that afternoon had been routine, or so they'd thought. Louis had been seeing Dr. Matthews for the past 8 months, following concerns raised by his teachers at school about his social interactions and communication patterns. Initially, both William and Catherine had dismissed the early observations as nothing more than Louis being a typical energetic boy who perhaps needed more time to mature. After all, he was the youngest of 3, often content to play alone or follow his siblings' lead rather than initiate interactions himself. His quirky habits, the way he lined up his toys in precise patterns, his fascination with specific textures, or his tendency to become overwhelmed in crowded situations, had seemed endearing rather than concerning. But, as months passed, the observations from his teachers at Thomas's Battersea became more frequent and detailed. Miss Henderson, Louis's primary teacher, had approached Catherine gently after school one afternoon, explaining that while Louis was bright and capable in many areas, he seemed to struggle with changes in routine and social cues that came naturally to other children his age. She'd mentioned his difficulty making eye contact during conversations and his tendency to repeat phrases he'd heard rather than engage in typical back-and-forth dialogue. Catherine remembered feeling a flutter of anxiety in her stomach during that conversation, though she'd maintained her composure and thanked Miss Henderson for her observations. That evening, she'd shared the discussion with William, and together they'd made the decision to seek professional guidance. They'd approached it practically, as they did most challenges in their lives, believing that early intervention and proper support would address whatever developmental differences Louis might be experiencing. The months that followed had been filled with appointments, assessments, and careful observation. Dr. Matthews had been thorough and patient, working with Louis through various exercises and interactions while William and Catherine watched from behind a two-way mirror. They'd filled out countless questionnaires about Louis's behaviors, preferences, and developmental milestones. They'd provided videos of Louis at home, playing with his siblings, and interacting during family activities. Throughout this process, Louis himself remained largely unaware of the adult concerns surrounding him. To him, the visits to Dr. Matthews were simply fun sessions where he got to play with interesting toys and solve puzzles. He particularly enjoyed the sensory play activities and the structured games that allowed him to demonstrate his remarkable memory for patterns and sequences. William had found himself studying his youngest son with new eyes during this period, noticing details he'd previously overlooked. The way Louis would cover his ears during loud celebrations, not out of defiance but from genuine discomfort. How he developed elaborate bedtime routines that, if disrupted, would leave him genuinely distressed rather than simply disappointed. The intensity with which he'd focus on his current interests, first it was trains, then construction vehicles, now it was space and rockets, absorbing information with an almost encyclopedic thoroughness. Catherine, meanwhile, had begun researching extensively, reading everything she could find about child development and neurodevelopmental differences. She'd reached out quietly to other parents, including some outside their royal circle, seeking perspectives and experiences. Her natural protective instincts had kicked into overdrive, though she'd been careful not to let Louis sense her increased attention and concern. The appointment yesterday had been meant to be a follow-up, a check-in on Louis's progress and development. Dr. Matthews had been working with him for several months by then, and both William and Catherine had hoped to hear that their concerns were unfounded, that Louis was simply developing at his own pace and would soon catch up with typical expectations for his age group. Instead, Dr. Matthews had asked them to stay after Louis had been taken to play in the adjacent room with one of her colleagues. Her expression had been kind but serious as she opened Louis's file and began to explain her findings. The words she'd used were clinical and careful: autism spectrum disorder, neurodevelopmental differences, sensory processing variations, but the impact on William and Catherine had been profound. Dr. Matthews had been quick to emphasize that autism presented differently in every child, and that Louis's particular profile suggested he was what many professionals called high-functioning, though she preferred to describe him as having significant strengths alongside specific challenges. His intelligence was clearly above average, his memory exceptional, and his ability to focus intensely on subjects that interested him was remarkable. However, he would likely always find social interactions more challenging than his peers, might struggle with unexpected changes, and would benefit from understanding and accommodations throughout his life. The drive home from that appointment had been unusually quiet. Louis had fallen asleep in his car seat, exhausted from the assessment activities, while George and Charlotte had been picked up by their protection officer to attend their respective after-school activities. William and Catherine had found themselves alone with their thoughts and their sleeping youngest son, processing the reality of what they'd just learned. That evening, after the children were asleep, they'd talked late into the night. Catherine had cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming nature of absorbing this new understanding of their child. William had held her close, his own emotions complex and shifting. There was relief in finally having answers to the questions they'd been carrying for months, but also a deep concern for what this might mean for Louis's future. They discussed the practical implications first, as was their way. Louis would need additional support at school, structured therapies to help with social skills and communication, and careful management of his environment to prevent overwhelm. They'd need to work with his teachers and the school administration to ensure he received appropriate accommodations. Dr. Matthews had already provided them with a comprehensive list of recommendations and resources. But, beyond the practical concerns lay deeper worries that neither had yet voiced fully. How would this affect Louis's role within the royal family? How would they protect him from the intense public scrutiny that came with his birthright? How would they help him navigate a world that often didn't understand or accommodate neurodivergent individuals, especially when that world would be watching his every move? Catherine had found herself thinking about Louis's personality in new ways. His love of routine and predictability, which had always seemed like simple childhood preference, now made sense as essential to his sense of security. His tendency to play alone for hours, building elaborate constructions or arranging his collections, wasn't antisocial behavior but, rather his natural way of processing the world. His occasional meltdowns when plans changed unexpectedly weren't defiance but, genuine distress at having his carefully constructed sense of order disrupted. William had reflected on his own childhood, remembering moments when he'd felt overwhelmed by public expectations and, wondering how much more challenging those experiences might be for a child who processed the world differently. The constant schedule changes, the formal events requiring specific behaviors, the need to interact gracefully with strangers, all of these aspects of royal life that he'd learned to navigate might present unique challenges for Louis. As they'd finally prepared for bed, Catherine had asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds: when and how should they share this information with others? The palace would need to know, certainly, as would immediate family members. The children's school would require detailed discussions about support and accommodations. Eventually, the public would need to understand why Louis might behave differently during official appearances or why certain accommodations were being made. But, perhaps most importantly, they'd need to decide when and how to explain to Lewis himself what made him unique. Dr. Matthews had advised that children often benefited from understanding their own neurodevelopmental differences, as it helped them make sense of their experiences and develop self-advocacy skills. However, the timing and approach would be crucial, especially given the additional complexity of Lewis's public role. Now, sitting at the breakfast table the morning after receiving this life-changing information, both William and Catherine were acutely aware of their son's every gesture and expression. Lewis continued arranging his cereal, occasionally making soft vrooming sounds under his breath. When Charlotte tried to engage him in conversation about their upcoming weekend plans, he responded with information about rocket launches he'd memorized rather than answering her actual question. A few months ago, they might have gently redirected him to respond appropriately to his sister. This morning, they simply watched and listened, beginning to understand these interactions through their new lens of awareness. George, always sensitive to adult emotions despite his young age, had grown quieter as breakfast progressed. He'd been watching his parents with increasing concern, clearly sensing that something significant was troubling them. Charlotte, meanwhile, had begun trying extra hard to engage both Lewis and her parents, her natural inclination to bring harmony to family situations kicking in. As the meal drew to a close and it came time to prepare for school, William and Catherine exchanged a meaningful look. They'd agreed the previous evening that they needed to speak with George and Charlotte soon. While Lewis was too young to fully understand the implications of his diagnosis, his older siblings deserved age-appropriate explanations that would help them better understand and support their younger brother. Catherine helped Lewis gather his school things, noticing how he checked each item multiple times and arranged them in his bag according to a specific system only he understood. This morning, instead of hurrying him along, she gave him the extra time he needed for his routine, recognizing it as an important part of how he prepared himself for the day ahead. William walked all three children to the car, engaging in their usual morning conversation about plans for the day. But, as Lewis climbed into his booster seat and immediately began organizing the small toys he always brought for the car ride, William found himself seeing his youngest son with completely new understanding. This wasn't a phase that Lewis would outgrow or a set of quirks he'd eventually abandon. This was simply who Lewis was, a bright, fascinating child who experienced and interacted with the world in his own unique way. As their protection officer drove the children to school, William and Catherine waved goodbye from the doorway of Adelaide Cottage. The morning routine that had been repeated hundreds of times before felt different now, weighted with new knowledge and understanding. They had always known that raising three children in the public eye would present unique challenges. Now they understood that one of those challenges would be ensuring that Lewis received the understanding, support, and acceptance he would need to thrive as his authentic self in a world that wasn't always designed for minds like his. The day ahead would bring the first of many difficult conversations. Catherine had arranged to meet with the head of Thomas's Battersea that afternoon to discuss Lewis's needs and the support systems the school could provide. William had scheduled a call with his private secretary to begin the sensitive process of informing key palace staff about Lewis's diagnosis and what it might mean for future engagements and public appearances. But, first, they would need to find the courage to share this news with their families. Catherine's parents would be supportive and loving, as they always were, but she worried about how to explain autism spectrum disorder to her mother without triggering unnecessary anxiety. William's family presented more complex considerations. His father, now King Charles, would need to understand not only Lewis's personal needs but also the implications for the monarchy itself. Camilla, with her gentle nature, would likely be wonderfully accepting, but there would be protocol discussions and considerations about public perception that would need careful handling. Most challenging of all would be finding the right words to help George and Charlotte understand their brother's differences without making them feel responsible for protecting or managing him. Both older children already showed natural protective instincts toward Lewis, but William and Catherine wanted to ensure this didn't become a burden or prevent them from having typical sibling relationships. As they cleared the breakfast dishes together in unusual silence, both William and Catherine were lost in their own thoughts about the journey ahead. They'd weathered many storms together as a couple and, as a family, but, this felt different. This wasn't a temporary crisis to be managed but, a permanent new reality that would shape every aspect of their family's future. Yet underneath their concerns and uncertainties lay a fierce love and determination. Louis was their son, their youngest child, the little boy who brought joy and laughter to their home every day. His autism diagnosis didn't change how much they adored him or how proud they were of his unique gifts and perspectives. If anything, understanding his neurological differences helped explain the qualities they'd always found most endearing about him: his intense focus, his detailed knowledge of his favorite subjects, his creative way of seeing the world. The path ahead would require patience, advocacy, and, probably more strength than they yet realized. There would be difficult moments when the demands of royal life clashed with Louis's needs for routine and predictability. There would be public scrutiny and, probably uninformed commentary about his behavior during official events. There would be decisions to make about how much information to share publicly and, when. But, there would also be opportunities to use their platform to increase understanding and acceptance of neurodivergent children. They could ensure that Louis grew up seeing his differences as part of what made him special rather than something to be hidden or fixed. They could model for other families how to embrace and support children who thought and processed the world differently. As Catherine loaded the dishwasher and William reviewed his schedule for the day, they both understood that their lives had shifted in a fundamental way. The carefree days of simply hoping their children would navigate their unusual circumstances without too many complications were behind them. Now they faced the more complex reality of ensuring that one of those children received the specialized understanding and support he would need throughout his life. But, they also recognized something else in this new reality: an opportunity to become even better parents, more attuned advocates, and, perhaps examples for other families facing similar journeys. Louis's autism wasn't a tragedy to be mourned or a problem to be solved. It was simply one aspect of who he was, their brilliant, funny, loving son who saw the world through his own unique lens and had so much to offer it in return. The afternoon light streamed through the windows of the headmistress's office at Thomas's Battersea as Catherine sat across from Mrs. Pemberton, Louis's school portfolio spread between them on the polished mahogany desk. Catherine had arrived early for their scheduled meeting, needing a few moments to collect her thoughts before diving into what she knew would be a detailed discussion about her youngest son's educational future. Mrs. Pemberton, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, had been expecting this conversation. As an experienced educator, she'd seen the signs in Louis that had prompted the referral to Dr. Matthews months earlier. Now, with an official diagnosis in hand, they could begin the important work of ensuring Louis received the support he needed to thrive academically and socially. Catherine had spent the morning preparing for this meeting, reviewing Dr. Matthews's comprehensive report and recommendations. The document was thorough, outlining Louis's strengths and challenges with clinical precision while also providing practical strategies for supporting his learning and development. As she'd read through the assessment results, Catherine had felt a mixture of emotions: pride in Louis's exceptional abilities in certain areas, concern about the challenges he'd face, and determination to ensure he received every opportunity to succeed. Mrs. Pemberton began the conversation by acknowledging what Catherine already knew, that Louis was a bright and capable child with unique gifts. His teachers had consistently noted his remarkable memory, particularly for factual information about his areas of interest. When the class had been studying space during their science unit, Louis had amazed everyone with his detailed knowledge of rocket specifications and planetary distances. His ability to focus intensely on tasks that captured his interest was extraordinary for a child his age. However, Mrs. Pemberton continued gently, they'd also observed areas where Louis struggled compared to his peers. Social interactions during unstructured playtime were particularly challenging for him. While other children naturally formed groups and engaged in cooperative play, Louis often preferred solitary activities or would attempt to direct play scenarios according to very specific rules that made sense to him but confused other children. Catherine listened carefully as Mrs. Pemberton described specific instances she'd observed. During a recent art project where children were supposed to work in pairs, Lewis had become distressed when his partner wanted to deviate from what Lewis considered the correct way to complete the assignment. Rather than finding a compromise, Lewis had withdrawn from the activity entirely, spending the remaining time organizing the art supplies into precise color-coded arrangements. Another example involved the school's weekly assembly, where children sat together on the floor while teachers presented information or performances. Lewis consistently struggled with the noise level and close proximity to other children, often covering his ears or asking to leave the room. The staff had learned to provide him with noise-reducing headphones and allow him to sit at the back of the group where he felt less overwhelmed, but they wanted to develop more comprehensive strategies. Mrs. Pemberton pulled out a thick folder containing observations and work samples from Lewis's teachers. Catherine found herself looking at her son's academic work with new understanding. His writing assignments, while demonstrating excellent vocabulary and creativity, often focused intensely on his current special interests. A recent essay about My Weekend had contained 2 full pages about the construction equipment he'd observed at a building site, with detailed descriptions of each machine's function and specifications, but no mention of the family picnic that had been the actual purpose of their outing. His artwork showed similar patterns. While other children drew varied subjects, families, houses, animals, fantasy creatures, Lewis's drawings were consistently focused on his current fascination. The walls of the classroom displayed dozens of his incredibly detailed rocket ships, each one precisely drawn with careful attention to technical accuracy. His teachers had learned to appreciate these intense interests rather than trying to redirect him toward more typical childhood subjects. Catherine shared Dr. Matthews's recommendations with Mrs. Pemberton, and, together they began developing a comprehensive support plan for Lewis. The plan would need to address multiple areas: academic accommodations, social skill development, sensory support, and emotional regulation strategies. For academics, they agreed that Lewis would benefit from having assignments modified to allow him to demonstrate his knowledge in ways that played to his strengths. Instead of traditional group projects that required complex social navigation, he might complete individual research presentations on topics that interested him. His exceptional memory and attention to detail made him capable of work well above his grade level in certain subjects, so they discussed options for enrichment activities that would keep him engaged. The social aspects would require more delicate handling. Mrs. Pemberton suggested implementing a structured peer buddy system, pairing Lewis with understanding classmates who could help model appropriate social interactions. They would also provide him with explicit instruction in social skills that other children seemed to absorb naturally, things like how to join a conversation, how to recognize when someone wanted to end an interaction, and how to compromise during group activities. Sensory support would be crucial for Lewis's comfort and learning. In addition to the noise-reducing headphones he already used during assemblies, they discussed providing him with a quiet space where he could retreat when feeling overwhelmed. A small corner of the classroom would be set up with comfortable seating, calming visual materials, and sensory tools like stress balls or fidget toys that could help him self-regulate. Mrs. Pemberton also suggested modifying the physical environment to reduce sensory overload. Lewis's desk could be positioned away from high-traffic areas, and they could provide him with advance notice of any changes to the daily routine. Fire drills and other unexpected disruptions were particularly difficult for him, so they would develop a system for preparing him when possible and supporting him through unavoidable surprises. As they talked, Catherine found herself sharing stories about Lewis at home that illustrated similar patterns. His bedroom was meticulously organized, with toys arranged in specific systems that he developed and maintained. Any disruption to these arrangements caused genuine distress. Family outings required careful planning to avoid overwhelming situations, and they'd learned to bring noise-reducing headphones and familiar comfort items when venturing into crowded places. Mrs. Pemberton listened thoughtfully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. It was clear that she and her staff genuinely cared about Lewis's well-being and were committed to helping him succeed. She mentioned that the school had recently invested in additional training for staff on supporting neurodivergent children, recognizing that students like Lewis brought unique gifts to their community while also requiring specialized understanding. The conversation turned to Lewis's relationships with other children. While he struggled with typical social interactions, he had formed a few meaningful connections with classmates who shared his interests or appreciated his unique perspective. There was Emma, a quiet girl in his class who enjoyed listening to his detailed explanations of rocket science. And James, another boy who was fascinated by Lewis's ability to remember obscure facts and would often seek him out during free play to ask questions about various subjects. Mrs. Pemberton suggested building on these natural connections while also gently expanding Lewis's social circle. They could create structured activities that brought together children with similar interests, providing a comfortable context for Lewis to practice social skills. The school's STEM club might be particularly beneficial, as it would allow Lewis to share his knowledge while learning alongside peers who appreciated technical subjects. Catherine appreciated Mrs. Pemberton's balanced approach. Rather than focusing solely on Lewis's challenges, she emphasized his strengths and the positive contributions he made to the classroom community. His teachers had learned to value his unique perspective and often called on him to share his extensive knowledge on various topics. Other children had begun to see him as the class expert on certain subjects, which had actually enhanced his social status in some ways. However, Mrs. Pemberton was also honest about the ongoing challenges. Lewis's need for routine and predictability sometimes clashed with the dynamic nature of school life. Substitute teachers were particularly difficult for him, as they disrupted his sense of familiarity and security. Special events like school plays or field trips required extensive preparation and support to ensure he could participate successfully. They discussed strategies for managing these situations. A visual schedule showing daily activities would help Lewis prepare for what was coming next. When possible, advance notice of changes would allow him time to process and adjust. For particularly challenging situations, they would develop scripts that Lewis could use when he felt unsure about how to respond appropriately. The meeting stretched longer than originally planned as they delved into specific accommodations and support strategies. Catherine found herself taking copious notes, amazed by the level of detail required to properly support her son's learning. She'd always known that raising children was complex, but understanding Lewis's specific needs opened her eyes to the intricacies of neurodevelopment and the importance of individualized approaches to education. Mrs. Pemberton also addressed the elephant in the room, Lewis's status as a member of the royal family. The school was experienced in maintaining privacy and security for high-profile families, but they would need to consider how Lewis's autism might affect public appearances or school events that attracted media attention. They agreed to work together to ensure that Lewis's needs were met without drawing unwanted attention to his differences. As the meeting concluded, Catherine felt a mixture of emotions. There was relief in knowing that Lewis would receive appropriate support at school, but also a soberness about the extent of planning and accommodation required for his success. The simple act of attending school, something most parents took for granted, would require ongoing collaboration between home and school to ensure Lewis's needs were met. Mrs. Pemberton walked Catherine to her car, continuing their conversation about next steps. They would meet again in 2 weeks to review how the initial accommodations were working and make adjustments as needed. Lewis's teachers would begin implementing the support strategies immediately, and they would monitor his response carefully. During the drive home, Catherine reflected on the conversation. She appreciated Mrs. Pemberton's professionalism and genuine care for Lewis, but the reality of coordinating his support felt overwhelming. Every aspect of his education would require careful consideration and planning. Simple things like class parties or playground activities would need modification to ensure his participation. Her phone buzzed with a text from William asking how the meeting had gone. She replied briefly that it had been productive but that they had much to discuss when he returned home. The complexity of Lewis's needs was becoming clearer with each conversation, and they would need to work together to navigate this new landscape. When she arrived at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine found the older children working on homework at the kitchen table while their nanny supervised. George looked up as she entered, his expression still reflecting the concern he'd shown at breakfast. Charlotte had arranged her supplies in neat piles, a trait that Catherine now recognized might be something she shared with her younger brother. Catherine helped herself to tea and sat with the children, asking about their day at school. George reported on a mathematics test he'd taken, while Charlotte excitedly described a science experiment involving volcanoes. Their normal, everyday concerns provided a welcome contrast to the weighty discussions she'd been having about educational accommodations and support strategies. When Louis bounded into the kitchen after being picked up from his after-school program, Catherine observed him with newly trained eyes. He immediately went to the refrigerator to retrieve his afternoon snack, following the exact routine he'd established weeks earlier. He arranged his crackers in a specific pattern before eating them, humming softly to himself as he worked. Charlotte tried to engage him in conversation about her volcano experiment, but Louis responded with facts about actual volcanic eruptions rather than showing interest in her classroom activity. A few months ago, Catherine might have prompted him to ask Charlotte questions about her experiment. Today, she simply listened and watched, beginning to understand that this was how Louis processed and responded to social interactions. When William arrived home that evening, Catherine was ready with a detailed report of her meeting with Mrs. Pemberton. They sat in his study after dinner, reviewing the extensive notes and recommendations that would guide Louis's educational support. William asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and the school's capacity to provide appropriate accommodations. Together, they reviewed Dr. Matthews's broader recommendations, which extended far beyond school support. Louis would benefit from occupational therapy to help with sensory processing and fine motor skills. Speech therapy could help him develop more natural conversational patterns and better understand social communication cues. They would need to find qualified professionals who understood autism spectrum disorders and could work effectively with a child in Louis's unique circumstances. The logistics felt daunting. Coordinating multiple therapy appointments while maintaining Louis's need for routine and predictability would require careful scheduling. They would need to consider how these additional commitments would affect family time and the siblings' activities. Every decision seemed to have ripple effects that needed to be considered and managed. William had spent his day beginning the delicate process of informing key palace staff about Louis's diagnosis. His private secretary had been understanding and supportive, immediately beginning research into how other royal families had handled similar situations. The palace communications team would need to develop strategies for managing public appearances and potential media questions about Louis's behavior. Most importantly, they'd begun the conversation about when and how to inform immediate family members. King Charles needed to be told soon, both as Louis's grandfather and as the head of the family whose decisions would affect Louis's future role. The conversation would require careful preparation, as they'd need to help him understand both the personal and institutional implications of Louis's autism. Catherine's parents would be easier to tell, as they'd already been wondering about some of Louis's behaviors and would likely be relieved to have answers. William's siblings would also need to be informed, particularly as they often participated in family events where Louis's needs would require consideration and accommodation. As they discussed the various conversations ahead of them, both William and Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. They were navigating uncharted territory, trying to balance their son's needs with the unique demands of royal life. There were no established protocols for raising a neurodivergent prince, no precedents to guide their decisions. Yet they also felt a growing determination to ensure that Louis's differences were treated with understanding and respect. If their family could model acceptance and support for neurodivergent children, perhaps they could help create a more inclusive society for all families facing similar challenges. Louis's autism was just one aspect of who he was, but it was an aspect that deserved recognition, accommodation, and celebration. The drawing room at Windsor Castle felt unusually formal as William and Catherine waited for King Charles to join them for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of their marriage. The autumn afternoon cast long shadows through the tall windows, and Catherine found herself unconsciously straightening the papers in her lap, Dr. Matthews's comprehensive report that they decided to share in full with William's father. 3 weeks had passed since their meeting with Mrs. Pemberton, and Lewis's support plan at school was already showing positive results. His teachers reported that the sensory accommodations were helping him remain calm and focused throughout the day, and the structured social activities were gradually improving his interactions with classmates. However, the broader family still needed to understand Lewis's diagnosis and what it would mean for everyone moving forward. William had requested this private meeting with his father under the pretense of discussing the children's education, which wasn't entirely untrue. They'd agreed that Charles deserved to hear about Lewis's autism directly from them, without the filter of staff or the complexity of a larger family gathering. The king's reaction would likely set the tone for how the broader royal family approached Lewis's differences. Catherine's own parents had received the news with characteristic warmth and understanding. Her mother had immediately begun researching autism spectrum disorders, asking thoughtful questions about how they could better support Lewis during family visits. Her father, ever practical, had offered to modify their home to create sensory-friendly spaces where Lewis could retreat if needed during gatherings. Their acceptance had been complete and immediate, providing Catherine with the emotional support she'd needed during these challenging weeks. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Charles's arrival. He entered the drawing room with his usual purposeful stride, his expression shifting from formal to concerned as he registered the serious tone of the meeting. After exchanging greetings, he settled into his favorite chair and looked expectantly at his son and daughter-in-law. William began carefully, explaining that they'd requested this private time because they had important news to share about Lewis. Charles's expression immediately grew alert, and Catherine could see him mentally preparing for various possibilities. Was Lewis ill? Had there been a security concern? The king's mind, trained by decades of receiving difficult news, was clearly cycling through potential scenarios. Catherine took over the narrative, her voice steady but emotional as she described the journey that had led them to Lewis's autism diagnosis. She spoke about the initial observations from his teachers, the months of assessment with Dr. Matthews, and the comprehensive evaluation that had finally provided them with answers. Throughout her explanation, Charles listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions but mostly absorbing the information with the careful attention he gave to all serious matters. When Catherine finished outlining the diagnostic process, William began explaining what the diagnosis meant in practical terms. He described Lewis's specific strengths and challenges, using examples that Charles would recognize from family gatherings. The way Lewis became overwhelmed during large family events now had an explanation. His intense focus on particular topics wasn't just childhood enthusiasm but a characteristic trait of his neurological makeup. His need for routine and predictability would require accommodation in all aspects of his life, including official royal duties as he grew older. Charles asked thoughtful questions about Lewis's intelligence and academic abilities, clearly concerned about his grandson's long-term prospects. Catherine was able to reassure him that Lewis's cognitive abilities were well above average in many areas. His memory was exceptional, particularly for factual information, and his attention to detail was remarkable. With appropriate support and understanding, there was no reason he couldn't succeed academically and eventually take on royal responsibilities in ways that suited his unique strengths and needs. The conversation turned to the immediate implications for family life and public appearances. Charles wanted to understand how Lewis's autism might affect traditional royal events, the Christmas gatherings at Sandringham, Trooping the Color, official photographs, and other ceremonial occasions. William and Catherine explained that with careful planning and accommodation, Lewis could continue participating in family events, though they might need to modify certain expectations and provide him with additional support. Charles listened as they described some of the accommodations that were already helping Lewis at school and home. Noise-reducing headphones for loud environments, advance warning about schedule changes, quiet spaces where he could retreat when overwhelmed, and structured activities that played to his strengths rather than highlighting his challenges. Many of these strategies could be adapted for royal events with proper planning. Catherine could see Charles processing not just the personal implications but also the broader considerations for the monarchy. How would the public react to learning that a young prince had autism? What would this mean for Louis's future role and responsibilities? How could they ensure that he received understanding and support while also maintaining the dignity and traditions of the royal family? William addressed some of these institutional concerns directly. They'd been consulting with communications experts and autism advocacy organizations to understand best practices for public disclosure and representation. The goal wasn't to hide Louis's differences but to present them in a way that promoted understanding and acceptance while protecting his privacy and dignity. Research had shown that public figures who openly discussed their neurodivergent family members often helped reduce stigma and increase acceptance in society. William and Catherine hoped that eventually, when the time was right, they could use their platform to advocate for better understanding and support for all neurodivergent children and their families. Charles asked about the other grandchildren and how George and Charlotte were handling their brother's diagnosis. Catherine explained that they hadn't yet told the older children explicitly about the autism diagnosis, but they were planning age-appropriate conversations that would help them understand Louis's differences and how they could be supportive siblings. George, at 11, had already shown remarkable intuition about his brother's needs. He'd naturally begun giving Louis extra time to process instructions during their play and had developed strategies for including him in activities without overwhelming him. Charlotte, ever the empathetic middle child, had been protective of Louis when other children didn't understand his behavior, though she didn't yet have the vocabulary to explain what made him different. The king wanted to know about treatment and intervention options. William and Catherine described the team of specialists they were assembling: occupational therapists to help with sensory processing, speech therapists to work on social communication skills, and educational specialists to ensure his academic needs were met. They emphasized that autism wasn't something to be cured, but rather a different way of processing the world that required understanding and accommodation. Dr. Matthews had been clear that early intervention and support could help Louis develop coping strategies and social skills that would serve him throughout his life. With proper support, many individuals with autism led successful, fulfilling lives, contributing their unique perspectives and abilities to their communities and careers. Charles asked practical questions about the financial implications of Louis's support needs. Private therapies and educational accommodations could be expensive, though cost wasn't a primary concern for their family. More importantly, they would need to ensure that any specialists they worked with could maintain appropriate confidentiality given Louis's public profile. The conversation gradually shifted to discussing next steps for informing the broader family. The Queen Consort would need to be told, as would William's siblings and their families. Charles suggested approaching these conversations thoughtfully, perhaps starting with those who interacted with Louis most frequently and gradually expanding the circle of knowledge. Catherine mentioned their hope to connect with other families who had navigated similar situations. There were other public figures and even minor royals in European monarchies who had children with autism or other neurodevelopmental differences. Learning from their experiences could provide valuable guidance for managing both the personal and public aspects of Louis's differences. As the afternoon wore on, Charles's initial concern had evolved into thoughtful consideration of how best to support his grandson. He asked about specific ways he could help during family gatherings, wanting to understand what accommodations might make Louis more comfortable during visits to royal residences. Catherine appreciated his practical approach and willingness to modify long-standing family traditions if necessary. Simple changes like providing Louis with a quiet retreat space during large gatherings, maintaining consistent meal times when possible, and giving him advance notice about planned activities could make an enormous difference in his comfort and participation. The king also wanted to understand how staff at various royal residences could be prepared to support Louis appropriately. Palace staff were accustomed to accommodating various needs and preferences, but autism awareness training might be beneficial to ensure everyone understood how to interact with Louis in ways that respected his differences. William raised the delicate question of public disclosure and timing. While they weren't ready to make any public announcements about Lewis's autism, they needed to consider how to handle situations where his behavior might seem unusual to observers. Recent public appearances had gone smoothly, but, as Lewis grew older and his differences became more apparent, they would need strategies for managing public perception. Charles suggested consulting with the palace communications team to develop messaging guidelines that could be used if questions arose. The key would be balancing transparency with privacy, providing enough information to promote understanding while protecting Lewis's right to develop and grow without excessive scrutiny. The conversation touched on the broader impact Lewis's autism might have on public perception of the royal family. Charles acknowledged that some members of the public might view neurodevelopmental differences as incompatible with royal duties, while others would appreciate the family's openness and advocacy for understanding. However, Charles was clear in his support for Lewis and his determination to ensure his grandson received every opportunity to thrive. The monarchy had evolved continuously throughout history, adapting to changing social understanding and expectations. Embracing neurodiversity could be seen as another positive evolution in the institution's approach to inclusion and representation. As the meeting drew to a close, Charles asked to spend some individual time with Lewis during upcoming family gatherings, wanting to better understand his grandson's interests and communication style. Catherine and William were touched by his desire to connect more meaningfully with Lewis and to support him as both a grandfather and as the head of their family. The king's final questions focused on long-term considerations. How might Lewis's role and responsibilities within the royal family be shaped by his autism? What accommodations might be needed as he grew older and took on more official duties? While these were questions that couldn't be answered immediately, Charles wanted to ensure that planning began early to set Lewis up for success. William and Catherine left Windsor feeling relieved and supported. Charles's reaction had been everything they'd hoped for: thoughtful, caring, and focused on Lewis's well-being rather than potential complications for the monarchy. His willingness to learn about autism and to modify family traditions as needed demonstrated the love and acceptance they'd hoped to receive. The drive home gave them time to process the conversation and plan their next steps. They would need to have similar discussions with Camilla, with William's siblings, and, eventually with Catherine's extended family. Each conversation would require careful consideration of the relationship dynamics and the individual's capacity to understand and support Lewis's needs. That evening, as they helped Lewis with his bedtime routine, both parents felt a sense of progress in their journey. The careful organization of his pajamas, the specific order of his bedtime stories, and the detailed goodnight ritual that had once seemed like childhood quirks now felt like important elements of his comfort and security. Lewis himself remained blissfully unaware of the adult conversations taking place around him. His world continued to revolve around his current fascination with space exploration, his carefully arranged collections, and his family's love and attention. The autism diagnosis hadn't changed who he was, it had simply provided his parents and family with better tools for understanding and supporting him. As Catherine tucked him into bed, Lewis asked his usual detailed questions about the next day's schedule. She answered each one patiently, providing the specific information he needed to feel secure about what was coming. These evening conversations, which had sometimes felt repetitive and unnecessary, now felt like essential communication that helped Lewis prepare mentally for each new day. The road ahead would still present challenges, but today had marked an important milestone in building the family support system that Lewis would need throughout his life. With his grandfather's understanding and backing, they were one step closer to creating an environment where Lewis could thrive as his authentic self while fulfilling whatever role destiny had in store for him. 6 months had passed since that pivotal conversation with King Charles, and the Wales family had settled into their new reality with a mixture of careful planning and growing confidence. The spring morning found Catherine in the garden at Adelaide Cottage, watching through the window as Lewis methodically arranged his collection of model rockets on the outdoor table, preparing for what he called his launch analysis session, a detailed review of each model's specifications that had become part of his Saturday morning routine. The decision to share Lewis's diagnosis with George and Charlotte had come naturally after several incidents where the older children had asked increasingly direct questions about their brother's behavior. Catherine remembered the afternoon when Charlotte had asked why Louis always needed to know every detail about family plans while she and George were content with general information. George, meanwhile, had begun defending Louis to school friends who didn't understand his intense interests or literal interpretation of their comments. The conversation with the siblings had taken place on a quiet Sunday evening in William's study. Catherine had prepared carefully, consulting with Dr. Matthews about age-appropriate language and concepts. They'd explained that Louis's brain worked differently from other people's brains, processing information and experiences in his own unique way. They'd emphasized his strengths, his incredible memory, his attention to detail, his passionate interests, while also helping the children understand why certain situations were more challenging for him. George had listened with the serious attention he brought to important matters, asking thoughtful questions about whether Louis would always be different and what that meant for their family. Charlotte had been primarily concerned with making sure Louis felt loved and included, immediately suggesting ways they could better accommodate his needs during family activities. Both children had shown remarkable maturity and acceptance, though they'd needed time to process and adjust their expectations. The months that followed had brought steady progress in many areas. Louis's therapy team had expanded to include an occupational therapist who specialized in sensory processing and a speech therapist who worked specifically with children on the autism spectrum. The sessions were carefully scheduled around Louis's school day and other activities, maintaining the routine structure that helped him feel secure. Mrs. Henderson, Louis's primary teacher at Thomas's Battersea, had become an invaluable partner in his development. The accommodations they'd implemented were working well, and Louis was thriving academically. His recent project on space exploration had impressed not only his classmates but also the visiting scientist who'd been invited to speak to the students. Louis had asked detailed, sophisticated questions that demonstrated his deep understanding of complex concepts. Socially, progress was slower but meaningful. The structured peer interactions Mrs. Pemberton had suggested were helping Louis develop friendship skills, though he continued to prefer smaller groups and predictable activities. His friendship with Emma had deepened, and they'd begun having regular playdates where they built elaborate space stations with construction blocks. James remained fascinated by Louis's encyclopedic knowledge and often sought his help with school projects. The most significant challenge had emerged around public appearances and family events. While Louis handled smaller, familiar gatherings well, large official functions continued to present difficulties. The previous month's Easter service at St. George's Chapel had required extensive preparation and accommodation. They'd arranged for Louis to wear noise-reducing headphones during the musical portions, and Catherine had sat ready to quietly escort him outside if he became overwhelmed. The service had proceeded smoothly until an unexpected moment during the processional when the organ volume increased dramatically. Louis had immediately covered his ears and turned toward Catherine with distress clearly visible on his face. She'd smoothly guided him to a side chapel where he could recover, returning after the loudest portions had concluded. The moment had been captured by photographers, and the palace communications team had later fielded questions about the young prince's reaction. This incident had prompted serious discussions between William, Catherine, and the palace staff about long-term strategies for managing public expectations and media coverage. They'd consulted with autism advocacy groups and communications experts about how other public figures had handled similar situations. The consensus was that honest, educational messaging would serve Louis's interests better than attempts to hide or minimize his differences. Dr. Matthews had been instrumental in helping them develop language for public communication about autism. She'd emphasized that Louis's differences weren't deficits to be apologized for but natural variations in human neurodevelopment that deserved understanding and accommodation. The goal was to normalize autism while also educating the public about appropriate expectations and responses. The decision to make a public statement about Louis's autism hadn't been taken lightly. William and Catherine had spent months consulting with experts, advocacy organizations, and families who'd navigated similar situations. They'd considered the timing carefully, wanting to ensure that Louis was emotionally prepared for increased attention and that appropriate support systems were in place. The announcement had been made through a carefully crafted statement that emphasized Louis's strengths while explaining some of his differences. They'd included information about autism spectrum disorders in general, directing people to resources for learning more. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with advocacy groups praising the family's openness and many parents sharing their own experiences with neurodivergent children. However, the increased public awareness had also brought challenges. Photographers and reporters now paid closer attention to Louis's behavior during public appearances, looking for signs of his autism. Some coverage had been respectful and educational, while other outlets had been more sensationalistic. The family had needed to develop new strategies for managing media attention while protecting Louis's privacy and dignity. One particularly moving development had been the response from other families with neurodivergent children. Catherine's office had received hundreds of letters from parents expressing gratitude for the representation and sharing their own stories. Many had included drawings or messages from their children to Louis, creating a collection that Catherine treasured and occasionally shared with him when appropriate. The broader royal family had adjusted to Louis's needs with varying degrees of success. Camilla had been wonderfully supportive, taking time to learn about autism and asking thoughtful questions about how she could better interact with her step-grandson. She'd modified her communication style to be more direct and literal, and had learned to give Louis advance warning about hugs or physical affection rather than surprising him with sudden displays of affection. William's siblings had also been supportive, though the adjustment had required some learning. Harry, despite living in California, had stayed informed about Louis's progress and had sent books and resources that might be helpful. The cousins had needed some guidance about playing with Louis, but children often adapted more easily than adults to different communication and interaction styles. The most significant challenge had been managing official royal duties and ceremonial obligations. Traditional protocols sometimes conflicted with Louis's needs for predictability and sensory accommodation. The palace staff had worked creatively to modify procedures when possible, while the family had accepted that some events might not be appropriate for Louis's participation. Catherine found herself becoming an advocate not just for her son but for autism awareness more broadly. She'd begun meeting with organizations that supported neurodivergent children and their families, learning about the challenges they faced and the resources they needed. Her platform as a royal provided opportunities to highlight these issues and promote better understanding. The speaking engagements and charity work had evolved naturally from her personal experience. Catherine had always been passionate about early childhood development, but Louis's diagnosis had given her advocacy a new focus and authenticity. Her speeches about neurodiversity and inclusion resonated with audiences because they came from genuine personal understanding rather than merely charitable interest. William had taken on his own advocacy role, particularly around ensuring that neurodivergent children had access to appropriate educational resources. His work with various educational charities had expanded to include specific focus on autism support in schools and teacher training programs. He'd become passionate about ensuring that other families didn't face the uncertainty and confusion they'd experienced before Louis's diagnosis. The therapy and intervention work continued to show positive results. Louis's communication skills were developing, though his conversational style remained uniquely his own. He'd learned to recognize when others wanted to change topics or end conversations, even if he didn't always find it natural to do so. His ability to advocate for his own needs was growing stronger, and he could now clearly express when he felt overwhelmed or needed a break. Sensory accommodations had become second nature for the family. Noise-reducing headphones traveled with them everywhere, and they'd learned to recognize the early signs that Louis was becoming overstimulated. Their home had been quietly modified to provide sensory-friendly spaces, and they'd established clear routines that gave Louis the predictability he needed to feel secure. The relationship between Louis and his siblings continued to evolve positively. George had become remarkably skilled at including Louis in activities while respecting his differences. He'd learned to present choices clearly and give Louis time to process changes. Charlotte had appointed herself as Louis's interpreter in some social situations, helping other children understand his communication style and interests. Both older children had also become natural advocates for autism awareness among their peers. They'd answered questions from school friends about why Louis behaved differently and had corrected misconceptions with patience and pride. Their acceptance and protection of their brother had become a source of strength for the entire family. Looking toward the future, William and Catherine felt cautiously optimistic about Louis's prospects. His academic abilities continued to excel, and, with appropriate support, he would likely succeed in higher education and, eventually find meaningful work that utilized his strengths. His role within the royal family would need to be carefully considered as he grew older, but there was no reason he couldn't contribute meaningfully to the monarchy's work in ways that suited his abilities and interests. The family had learned to take challenges one at a time rather than worrying about hypothetical future difficulties. Each milestone, successful school events, positive social interactions, comfortable public appearances, built their confidence that Louis would find his way in the world with their support and society's growing understanding. Dr. Matthews continued to work with Louis regularly, now focusing more on developing self-advocacy skills and emotional regulation strategies that would serve him as he grew older. She'd been impressed by his progress and the family's commitment to providing consistent, informed support. Their willingness to advocate publicly for autism awareness had also created opportunities for research and resource development that would benefit other families. The spring morning continued peacefully as Catherine watched Louis complete his rocket analysis session. His methodical approach and detailed observations were no longer seen as quirky childhood behavior but recognized as expressions of his unique cognitive strengths. When Charlotte joined him in the garden and began asking questions about his rockets, Louis patiently explained each model's specifications, his face lighting up with joy at sharing his knowledge with someone who was genuinely interested. These moments of natural family interaction reminded Catherine of how far they'd come in understanding and supporting Louis. The initial shock and uncertainty of his diagnosis had evolved into informed advocacy and confident accommodation. They'd learned that autism wasn't something that happened to their family but simply one aspect of who Louis was, their brilliant, loving, unique son who saw the world through his own special lens. The future remained unwritten, but it was a future they faced with knowledge, support, and determination. Louis would continue to grow and develop, facing new challenges and discovering new strengths. His family would continue learning and advocating, using their experience to help other families navigate similar journeys. And, gradually, the world was becoming a more understanding and accommodating place for all neurodivergent individuals, one conversation and one act of acceptance at a time. As Catherine called the children inside for lunch, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought their family to this point. Louis's autism diagnosis had initially felt like devastating news, but it had ultimately become the key to understanding and celebrating the remarkable child they'd always known him to be. Their story was still being written, but it was a story of love, acceptance, and the endless potential that existed when children were truly seen and supported for who they were meant to be.